Glofcast lives. Hello, 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 hello. You are tuned into Glofcast. I want to say this is like 12 or something like that. It's been a while. I know. I'm trying to get kind of back on my grind. Who knows what it is? So the tone of the channel is kind of shifting into these random little snippets of thoughts that I'm kind of having at kind of random intervals. So I still like to do kind of the more developed stuff. So with every Glofcast I've pretty much had a script, and it takes me it's not an easy thing to kind of come up and kind of like make it as easy as it is possible, but it takes time versus the kind of more off the cuff stuff. That's just something I've been kind of wanting to, I guess, talk about more or less. So I know it's been way too long since I've made one of these. I've kind of devoted my time to writing more tax articles because that's my primary profession, and if you look around hard enough online, you can probably find them. So anyways, this week's Glofcast will focus on Gnosticism and what it is, Gnostic philosophy, its development through the ages, and kind of what the more contemporary strands of Gnosticism that exist today are. Excuse me, keep clearing my throat. So, over the summer, I went to a festival with my girlfriend. It was called Pagan Fest, and they had some pretty cool stuff there. They had, like, lots of crystals, kind of the more Wookiee kinds of stuff, but they also had a book stand, and in this book stand, it was a variety of books around, like, magic and crystals and stuff like that, but there was one called, it's one that I bought. I found it pretty interesting. It was by a man named Tobias Churton, who is kind of, I think he's over at Oxford. I'm pretty sure he's over at Oxford, and it's a book called Gnostic Philosophy, and it delves into what Gnosticism is, the strands of it that have kind of existed throughout history, and pretty much other miscellaneous stuff about Gnosticism. And it was a fantastic book, really, really great fucking book. I highly recommend if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So basically, kind of what I'm going to be talking about today is the book is going to be a lot of what I'm going to cite, but I will also use other sources as well to kind of keep things a little bit more well-rounded. So with all of that said, what exactly is Gnosticism? What does it mean to be Gnostic, or really? So we can think of Gnosticism as derived from the Greek word gnosis. So gnosis is an ancient Greek feminine noun that means knowledge, and it's actually a pretty prevalent concept in Christianity, specifically Orthodox Christianity. But it begs the question of knowledge of what? And that's a pretty broad question. So knowledge as a concept, what it is and how we attain it, aka how we come to know what knowledge is, it's the entire basis for the branch of philosophy known as epistemology. And while Gnosticism and Gnostics are obviously a broad group with a very broad variety of opinions on certain things, what unites many Gnostics is the idea of a type of quote-unquote secret knowledge that they have about either the nature of God, the nature of humanity, history, the universe, or really any kind of this secret knowledge. So if the word Gnostic means to have knowledge, its antithesis is to be agnostic, or to have no certainty or knowledge or even ability to have said knowledge. So the most common way one would use the term agnostic to describe is agnosticism with regards to whether or not they believe in a God. So the agnostic has no knowledge and believes nobody can have any knowledge on the existence of a deity. So if we take a step further, we get what's known as the agnostic atheist, which is an atheist that does not believe in a God. Keep clearing my throat. Nor does said atheist believe that such knowledge of a God can even be attained. So if you contrast this with a Gnostic atheist who believes that one can have knowledge on God's ontological status, and that this ontological status is non-existent. So more or less, they can know factually that God does not exist. Or alternatively, the agnostic theist, who, if they were to guess, they would say that God does exist, but they wouldn't have one way to prove it either which way. So no knowledge, just kind of a hunch that God does exist. And so the final category in this quadrant, and the one that I would personally subscribe to, is the lowercase g Gnostic theist, who believes God exists and that there exists a solid epistemological basis for existing. So I have multiple reasons for believing this, one of the chief ones being Aquinas' cosmological arguments, which I'm planning on getting to that in a later video. It's something that I do kind of want to touch upon, hopefully make a decent argument about. So far, it seems like I've established Gnosticism as nothing more than knowledge-ism, so whatever that means. But Gnosticism has a long and varied history, primarily as a Christian heresy, but even going before that. So it recently got revived in the news in the past decade or two due to the discovery of what's called the Gnostic Gospels. So most notably the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of... There's several of them. I think Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Jesus, I believe, the Apocryphon of John. There's a whole variety of them in what's called the Nag Hammadi Library, which I think was a fairly recent discovery. I would say in the latter half of the 20th century. So some people called these the Lost Gospels, which have, surprise, surprise, secret or hidden knowledge of the life or nature of Jesus Christ, such as Jesus' hidden brother, hidden wife, hidden child, or the fact that Jesus may have killed and revived his teacher because one day he woke up and that particular teacher tested his patience that day. So some may wonder why these Gnostic Gospels, such as, like I said before, the Gospels of Judas or Thomas and the Apocryphon of John, they were not included in the New Testament. So in many parts, these Gnostic Gospels, they had a certain emphasis on this secret knowledge, which it would often come into conflict with the canonical Gospels, such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So in addition, the canonical Gospels were also the more likely... They were essentially a little bit better in terms of their sourcehood, I guess. They were a little bit more primary sources, so they were written closely around the time of Jesus or at most several decades after, whereas the Gnostic Gospels were often written centuries afterwards. So the New Testament is the most reliable historical document we have for that time period. The New Testament is actually a very, very reliable source in terms of, and you can kind of tie this back to kind of a lot of the writings of non-Christian writers such as Josephus and Tacitus. They have writings that tie to what's being said in the New Testament. So the Gnostic Gospels were not declared divinely inspired because they often had biased or erroneous information. One instance is kind of... I just watched a pretty good video on this. It was like Religion for Breakfast. He was talking about kind of the Gnostics and either the Gospel of Judas or Thomas. I think it was Judas. And he was basically talking... One of the first lines in it talked about the proclivity for secret knowledge that this text may have had, which would suggest that it had a sort of bias that was in place. And in terms of how reliable it actually was, it wasn't as reliable as what was actually in kind of the canonical Gospels. So I'm not going to get too deep into them, but the YouTuber, like I said, Religion for Breakfast, has some very great short videos on Gnosticism and the Gnostic Gospels of Judas and Thomas. So the thing is, though, with regards to the Gnostic Gospels, it doesn't really paint a clear picture of what the Gnostics actually believed. Although the Gnostics, they did take a lot of influence from Plato, although ultimately rejected by the Neoplatonists of the 3rd century. So, for example, famous Neoplatonist Plotinus did not like a lot of what the Gnostics stood for, despite Platonism and Gnosticism having really a lot of similarities. So, in short, the Gnostics believed in dualism. So, with the spiritual world kind of governing the lower material world. So, that's kind of one key in Gnosticism, is that the spiritual world is far superior, it's good, and the material world is really actually evil. It's something far lower. And so, that's kind of what the Gnostics believe. The spiritual world is a higher world of goodness. Think of it, the world of forms, so similar to Plato's realm of forms, and that realm of goodness is governed by the monad, or the one, the highest being in Gnosticism, which is, for all intents and purposes, God. So contrast that to their view of the material world, which was inherently evil and governed by a being known as the demiurge. So Tobias Churton laid out a pretty good summary of what the Christian Gnostics believed in the early, I think it was probably the 1st through 5th centuries. So he cites this as being given to them as intellectual fodder by Paul, the one who was the disciple of Jesus, who was he was originally Saul, but then he was traveling around Rome and really pretty much everywhere, just spreading everything, spreading the good news. So these are kind of a summary of what the Christian Gnostics believed. So it was the belief in the distinction between the natural and spiritual human, and belief that Christ had shattered the powers of nature's spiritual governors, belief that the flesh belongs to Satan and cannot inherit the kingdom of God, belief that the redeemed spiritual person or saint is superior to not only the natural order but even the angels, since the saint had to technically overcome his materiality, belief that the power of the Jewish law had no control over Gentile converts, belief that the prophecy was a continual gift of God, belief that gifted Christians had access to the mind of Christ, belief that gnosis was a genuine gift of the Holy Spirit, and belief that the climax of the spiritual journey could be expressed in terms of knowledge. So there's a few themes there. Most of those themes kind of revolve around the Gnostic proclivity towards a type of knowledge. And sorry about that, folks. Had to kind of adjust my mic there. So apparently it was very quiet and then I had to cough. So sorry, where was I? So essentially those themes that we were laying out, they're essentially like, you can kind of tell a few of the themes that were present in that list that Tobias Churton just said. It's a lot of it revolves around knowledge, and knowledge is kind of almost the highest good. And the disdain for the material world and the expression of the spiritual world, that's kind of it's almost secondary in this list. So as we can see, Gnosticism, it really revolves around knowledge as kind of being the highest possible good. And so a few of these could almost be applicable to non-Gnostic Christians as well, such as the refusal of the Jewish law and the prophecy as a gift, but the rest are highly exclusive to Gnosticism. So note that within the Gnostic worldview of the higher spiritual realm and the lower material realm exists a duality. So a duality of the spiritual and the material, the monad and demiurge, good and evil, God and the world. So dualism is a humongous theme in Gnosticism, so when talking about it or doing research on it, just kind of keep that in mind. It's an ever-present theme whenever kind of dealing with Gnosticism. So, and also the Gnostic rejection of the material paints a fundamental difference in between the Gnostic and the Christian worldviews. Since Genesis chapter 1 states God created the heaven and the earth, and it was good. So that's just a fundamental kind of difference. And in a way, you can almost view Christianity as viewing the fundamental difference between Christianity and Gnosticism is Christianity views maybe the spiritual and the material in and of kind of almost the same essence in a way. That's kind of what Jesus was. He was kind of the spiritual meets the material. And so that's it's a rejection of the Gnosticism where the Gnostic tries to differentiate the two in such a way and kind of keep them very, very separate. So other Gnostic concepts to keep in mind are the pleroma. So the pleroma is the totality of divine powers, such as the Godhead. The eons, which can be thought of as a type of emanation or stage of God. So think of them, the eons, as kind of an angel encompassing the totality of the Godhead. In a way, I will almost take kind of an almost perennialist view of the eon. It's like, I think the perennialist view is that God has appeared on earth in particular stages. So he was here with Jesus, he was here with the Buddha, he was here with Muhammad, he was here with flippin' Joseph Smith, and that he comes to earth and with regards to these iterations. I think that's what the definition is, don't quote me on that, but that's kind of a way of how I see the eons. And one of the more important aspects of Gnosticism is what's known as Sophia. So Sophia it's not a literal person per se. And Sophia is like kind of, it's a particularly interesting one. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. So if you look at the word philosophy, which literally means love of wisdom, you can see the word Sophia kind of present in there, and is seen as a type of feminine emanation to God through wisdom and gnosis, so wisdom and knowledge. So she is, I wouldn't really call her like a literal person, just such as like Mary Magdalene. She was kind of more of, to get young in with it, kind of an archetype, kind of a spiritual entity, an emanation of God, if you will, kind of a part of that. So she is, in fact, I believe she is the lowest emanation of God and viewed in part as fallen in some sort of way. So in part in creating the evil material world. So in some Gnostic circles, Sophia is seen as the sister Aeon to Jesus Christ, although I do not believe that a literal woman named Sophia, who is a type of emanation of wisdom, has ever actually existed, like I said previously. However, one can see the dualism between the masculine Jesus and the feminine Sophia, two eons of Gnosticism. So one important aspect to note is the Gnostic categorization of Jesus. So there really isn't a particular Gnostic consensus about it, although many Gnostics view Jesus Christ as the bringer of knowledge to the world in some capacity. So some Gnostics viewed him as a material being who had achieved gnosis and had shared what he had learned with his disciples. Some other Gnostics viewed him as a purely spiritual being, and which would therefore nullify his sacrifice. And some more viewed him as kind of a false messiah who perverted the teachings of his contemporaries who, in their view, were the true achievers of gnosis, such as John the Baptist. So you can see why Gnostics and non-Gnostic Christians did not really get along, and why Gnosticism as a heresy, it just loves to linger around, even though it may not technically always be under the name of Gnosticism. So just as kind of an aside, but the Gnostic interpretation of Jesus Christ really illustrates Christ's figure as an archetypal oddity, and in turn Christianity's oddity as a belief system. So one particular strangeness about Christianity is kind of the central focus of Christianity, aka the Christ, as a strange unity of the eternally powerful and eternally pathetic. And I don't mean pathetic as a kind of pejorative, but I mean it in terms of generating large amounts of pity from onlookers, whereas you can kind of view power as, what would the opposite of pity be? I don't know if it'd necessarily be power, but if you're powerful, you kind of generate a lot of, I guess, respect from onlookers in some way, shape, or form. So that respect can be manifested as a type of fear, as a type of envy, as a type of just liking who you are and kind of wanting to be on your team. So, and because the central tenet of Christianity is ultimately pathetic, for lack of a better word, a man wrongly sentenced to death in the most brutal and sorrowful of ways, only to become the most powerful image, the most powerful meme in a Richard Dawkins unit of culture sense, and really the most powerful being known to man. It's just one oddity, the inversion of the powerful and pathetic. And I'll go into detail on a future episode on the strangeness of Christianity, but that's just kind of an aside. I was originally kind of gonna include like some comparisons to like Buddhism or Islam in here, but it's in my opinion, it would kind of derail the focus on Gnosticism. So I'll touch base on that in a later show. So now we should have a solid taste of what Gnosticism is, as well as its relationship to Christianity. So Gnosticism as a system, oftentimes it'll have tie-ins with things like occultism and magic, although nothing inherent within the ideology suggests that the occult or magic is a necessary component of it. So unless you really see a type of gnosis as kind of achieving magic, in my view, I don't see them as necessary. I don't see stuff like occultism and magic as particularly necessary. Maybe in terms of secret knowledge, it could incorporate that, but a lot of it could also be just with regards to the universe around you. So Gnosticism as a belief system is highly fluid, with many iterations taking place throughout the centuries. So these iterations do not need to explicitly call themselves Gnostic, but if they have many of the similarities, such as emphasis on duality or secret knowledge or disdain for the material world while maintaining a simultaneous lingering for the spiritual, it could be viewed as a type of Gnosticism. So there have existed Jewish pre-Christian Gnostics, Christian Gnostics, and pagan Gnostics, such as the Neoplatonists, although having some disagreements with the Christian Gnostics at the time, could very well be seen as an ultimately Gnostic belief system. So Tobias Churton suggests that the famous three magi present at the birth of Christ in Bethlehem as pursuing gnosis via the use of magic and the Jewish Kabbalah, which is a kind of Jewish mystical system, from what I understand. So in the Islamic world, the Sufis were Islamic mystics who used esotericism and mysticism to pursue experiential knowledge of the divine. So in other words, that's gnosis right there. Gnosis is essentially experiential knowledge. So, excuse me. So, in my opinion, probably one of the more interesting Gnostic sects was the Cathars. They were a 13th century Gnostic Christian sect based in the Languedoc section of France. And the thing with the Cathars, I'm going to call them Cathars. The thing with the Cathars is they were known for their unusually progressive social attitudes at the time. And so it was actually very interesting in my opinion. The Cathars believed in reincarnation until the soul denied the material world outright, where man could reincarnate as a woman and vice versa, essentially rendering gender meaningless. So they believe this was due in part due to the ultimate genderlessness and immateriality of the spirit present in every human. So because of this rejection of gender, women and men were viewed as equally capable spiritual leaders. And the Cathars also reverenced Mary of Magdalene more than early Christian leaders, with some Cathars reverencing her more than Saints Peter or Paul. So socially, the Cathars, they abhorred killing and capital punishment, but interestingly, they did not believe in reproduction. So the Cathars saw reproduction as a type of continuation into the material evil world. So as a result, the Cathars practiced sodomy. So the perfecti, in other words, kind of the pure Cathars, they did also not eat anything from the flesh of an animal, so they were essentially vegetarians. So they were really some medieval hippies. That's essentially what the Cathars were. So I found them particularly interesting. Other Gnostic sects include, obviously, Rosicrucians, Freemasons. These guys have been kind of the subject of a lot of conspiracy theories. Some believe, including Churton, he believes that the Knights Templar had some Gnostic qualities in there. Carl Jung had a large degree of influence from Gnosticism, specifically when Jung wrote about the pleroma, defined previously as the type of godly essence or godhead. So Jung writes of the nothing or emptiness as the same as the everything or fullness. To quote Jung, "In the pleroma there is nothing and everything. It is not profitable to think about the pleroma, for to do that would means one's own dissolution." So obviously Jung was a psychologist. He was probably the psychologist for a lot of this. So his goal was to totally understand the human psyche through what was known as archetypes. So the symbolic images present in the dreams of individuals used to find the keys of psychoanalysis, images which were a conscious application of Gnostic archetypes. So Churton also makes an interesting case relating Gnosticism around science and specifically physics. So in all of the chapters of Gnostic philosophy, this one was perhaps the most mind-blowing and perhaps makes the best case for the Paul Joseph Watson or Elon Musk take that we live in a simulation. And so I don't know if I should summarize it here because I'll probably butcher the hell out of it, but I will say that it really gives cadence to the Platonic view of reality over the Aristotelian view. And if you want, you can... I don't know. I recommend getting the book and reading the flippin' book because it is a very, very interesting read. So I'll end this with a quote by Niels Bohr. So anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood it. And that is from probably one of the most esteemed physicists of the 20th century. So, with regards to Gnosticism, specifically, the chapter gives a nod to the Gnostic rejection of the material by saying the material exists far more fluidly than previously believed. So, other strands of contemporary Gnosticism could be viewed as the New Agey Eckhart Tolle types, although Tolle probably promotes a type of Buddhist Gnosticism. You could view Scientology as a kind of Gnosticism, and even today there are some self-described Gnostic sects who would just call themselves seekers of the secret knowledge. And so, in short, that kind of concludes this episode on Gnosticism. I hope you found it enlightening. I will try to I think what my goal is for Glofcast is kind of maybe... I don't think I necessarily have time to do these long episodes, but I will definitely try to get maybe a weekly snippet of something. So, I don't know, just something to kind of think about. I hope you found this podcast enlightening, and I will see you next time. Take care.